The crystal chandeliers of Belmont's restaurant cast perfect light on wealthy diners who never looked twice at the servers, but when Julian Cross, a millionaire investor, decided to humiliate Nia Brooks, a young black waitress, by ordering in a rare foreign language, he assumed she was just another invisible worker who wouldn't understand what he had no way of knowing was that Nia's disappeared father had spent years teaching her languages for a reason, and the words Julian chose to mock her were about to become the key that would unlock secrets powerful enough to destroy his entire empire. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The crystal chandeliers cast golden light across marble floors, so polished they looked like frozen water. Soft piano music drifted through the air, mingling with the quiet murmur of conversation and the delicate clink of silverware against fine china. This was Belmont's, the kind of restaurant where reservations required 3 months' notice and a credit card that didn't flinch at 4-digit dinners. The walls were adorned with abstract art that cost more than most people's homes, and the leather seating whispered wealth with every carefully stitched seam. Nia Brooks moved through the dining room with practiced grace, her black server's uniform pressed crisp, her movements efficient but unhurried. She carried herself with a calmness that made her nearly invisible to the wealthy patrons scattered throughout the room. They didn't look at her, not really. She was part of the scenery, like the orchids on each table or the art on the walls. Her dark skin seemed to fade into the shadows between the candlelit tables, which suited her just fine. Invisibility was safety. Invisibility was survival. The evening crowd tonight was typical for a Thursday. Old money mixing with new tech fortunes. Executives celebrating closed deals. Couples maintaining appearances while their marriages crumbled in silence. Nia had learned to read the room like a book written in body language and stolen glances. But Nia saw everything. She noticed the businessman in the corner who'd ordered his third scotch in 40 minutes. His tie loosened, his laughter getting louder with each glass. She saw the couple by the window whose forced smiles didn't match their tense body language, the woman's knuckles white around her wine stem. She observed the woman dining alone who kept checking her phone with increasing anxiety, her untouched salad wilting under her distracted gaze. Nia had learned to read people the way others read books, picking up details that most would miss. It was a survival skill she developed young, long before she needed it to navigate rooms like this. Her father had taught her that too, though she hadn't understood it at the time. Watch people's hands, he'd say. Hands tell you what words hide. Watch their eyes. Eyes reveal what the mouth refuses to speak. The restaurant hummed with the kind of power that came from old money and new deals. Conversations happened in lowered voices, sealed with handshakes worth millions. The staff moved like shadows, anticipating needs before they were spoken. Nia paused near the kitchen entrance, adjusting the leather portfolio she used for taking orders. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She already knew what it was. The third rent reminder this week. She'd ignored the first two, not because she'd forgotten, but because there was nothing she could do about it yet. Payday was still 5 days away, and even then, she'd be short. She slipped into the service corridor, that narrow space between the glittering dining room and the chaos of the kitchen. Here, the illusion dropped. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, harsh and revealing. The smell of bleach mixed with food, garlic and lemon, and something burnt from earlier service. Staff members hurried past, their polite masks temporarily removed, replaced with exhaustion and frustration. Nia pulled out her phone and scrolled through the messages. Rent. The third notice this week, each one more insistent than the last. She was already calculating which bills she could push to next month, which ones would accept late payments without penalties. A voicemail from the hospital billing department about her father's old medical debt that somehow kept finding her, despite her having no legal obligation to pay it. They didn't care about legality. They cared about guilt, about pressure, about wearing people down until they paid anyway. A text from her roommate asking if she could cover utilities this month. Again, the numbers swirled in her head. Even with tonight's tips, even if she picked up the Saturday double shift Marcus kept offering, she'd still be short. She'd been short for 3 months now, juggling payments like a circus act, hoping nothing dropped. She closed her eyes and took a slow breath, counting to 5 the way her therapist had taught her before her insurance ran out. When she opened them again, her gaze fell on the worn leather notebook tucked into her apron pocket. It was small, bound with a rubber band, its pages filled with symbols and phrases in languages most people had never heard of. She'd carried it for 3 years now, ever since she'd found it in her father's abandoned apartment. She didn't take it out. Not here, but knowing it was there steadied her somehow. Nia. She turned to find Marcus Hale approaching, the restaurant's general manager. He was a thin man in his 50s with silver hair and a permanent expression of controlled concern. Everything about Marcus was carefully managed, from his tailored suit to his diplomatic smile. "Yes, Mr. Hale. Table 7 is being seated now. I need you to take it personally." Nia glanced toward the dining room. Table 7 was prime real estate, positioned near the window with a view of the city skyline. It was usually reserved for Marcus's most important clients. "Of course," she said. Marcus stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Julian Cross. He's one of our most valued guests. International investor, multiple business holdings. He dines here monthly, and he expects exceptional service." "I understand. Do you?" Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly. "Mr. Cross is particular. He notices everything. One mistake, one moment of anything less than perfect, and he'll remember it. These people matter, Nia. They matter to this restaurant, and they should matter to you." The implication was clear. "Don't embarrass me. Don't embarrass yourself. Don't give me a reason to question whether you belong here." "I'll take care of it," Nia said evenly. Marcus studied her for another moment, then nodded. "Good. Remember, we're not just serving food. We're maintaining relationships that keep this place running." He walked away, already greeting another guest with that practiced warmth that never quite reached his eyes. Nia returned to the dining room, composing her expression into pleasant neutrality. As she approached table 7, she caught her first glimpse of Julian Cross. He entered the restaurant like he owned it. Maybe he did, for all she knew. Wealthy people had a way of owning things without bothering with paperwork. He was tall, probably late 30s, with dark hair styled just carelessly enough to look expensive. Every strand seemed deliberately placed to appear effortless. His suit was charcoal gray, perfectly tailored, the kind that cost more than Nia made in 3 months. The fabric moved with him like water, expensive wool blend that probably had an Italian name she couldn't pronounce. He wore a watch that caught the light, all polish and precision. He moved with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no in any meaningful way, who'd never had to wonder if there'd be enough money at the end of the month, who'd never calculated the cost of a single meal against a week of groceries. The hostess practically glowed as she led him to his table, her voice pitched higher than usual, her movements more careful. Other diners glanced over, some with recognition, others with curiosity, that instinctive response to someone who carried power like a second skin. Julian acknowledged none of them, his attention fixed ahead with the certainty of someone accustomed to being watched. He didn't need to look at people to know they were looking at him. Behind him walked a woman who seemed to glide rather than walk. She was stunning in that effortless way that came from good genetics and better resources. Her dress was simple, cream-colored, probably designer. Her dark hair fell in perfect waves past her shoulders. But it was her eyes that caught Nia's attention, sharp and observant despite her serene smile. This had to be Elena, his fiancée. Marcus had mentioned her during the pre-shift meeting. The hostess seated them with practiced efficiency, handing over leather-bound menus and promising their server would be right with them. Julian barely acknowledged her, already scanning the wine list. Elena, however, offered a genuine thank you that made the hostess light up. Nia approached the table with her portfolio ready, her expression professionally pleasant. "Good evening. My name is Nia, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. Can I start you off with something to drink, or would you like a moment to look over the menu?" Julian looked up, and Nia felt his gaze sweep over her in that way certain people did, the kind of look that cataloged and dismissed in the same instant. He smiled, but it didn't soften his eyes. "We'll start with a bottle of the Chateau Margaux. 2015, he said. His voice was smooth, cultured, with the kind of accent that suggested expensive boarding schools and international upbringing. And bring us the oyster selection while we decide on the rest. Excellent choice. I'll have that right out for you. As Nia turned to leave, she heard Elena's softer voice. The oysters sound lovely. Thank you. Nia had worked at Belmont's long enough to recognize the dynamic. Julian was the kind of man who expected the world to arrange itself around his preferences. Elena, for all her polish, seemed to navigate his orbit with practiced care. In the wine cellar, Nia selected the bottle Marcus had surely known Julian would order. Chateau Margaux 2015, $1,200. She checked the price once out of curiosity and immediately regretted it. That was rent, utilities, groceries, and metro passes for 2 months. More than that, that was breathing room. That was not lying awake at 3 in the morning doing math, calculating which bill could wait another week. All of that security, sealed in glass, waiting to be consumed in an hour and forgotten by morning. She ran her fingers over the smooth, embossed label. Somewhere in France, people had grown these grapes, tended the vines, harvested at precisely the right moment. Someone had crafted this bottle with care, and Julian Cross would barely taste it. He would tip more than it cost without thought. She pushed the thought away, carefully wrapping the expensive bottle in a white cloth. This wasn't her world. She was just passing through it, collecting paychecks and staying invisible. That's what she told herself every night. When she returned to the table, Julian was leaning back in his chair, describing something to Elena with animated gestures. Elena watched him with an expression that could have been admiration or something more complicated. She laughed at the right moments, touched his arm with familiar affection, but there was something measured about it all, like an actress who knew her lines perfectly. Nia presented the wine, going through the ritual of showing the label and uncorking the bottle with practiced precision. Julian barely watched, continuing his story. But when she poured a small amount for him to taste, he paused mid-sentence and lifted the glass with sudden focus. He swirled, sniffed, tasted. His expression shifted through micro-movements of evaluation. "Acceptable," he said, as if he'd been expecting to find fault. Nia filled both glasses and stepped back. "Have you had a chance to look over the menu? Or would you like a few more minutes?" "Give us 10 minutes," Julian said, waving her away without looking up. Nia moved to her other tables, checking in with an older couple celebrating their anniversary and refilling water glasses for a business dinner that had been going for 2 hours. She moved through her section with efficient grace, but her awareness kept pulling back to table 7. Something about Julian Cross felt familiar in a way she couldn't quite place. Not him specifically, but the type. The way he occupied space. The casual certainty that the world would bend to accommodate him. When she returned to table 7, Julian looked up with a different kind of smile, one that made her instinctively cautious. "We're ready to order," he said. "Wonderful. What can I get for you this evening?" Julian leaned back, his fingers drumming once against the table. "I'll start with the foie gras, then the duck breast, medium rare. Elena will have the burrata, followed by the sea base." Elena opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it, her smile tightening almost imperceptibly. "How would you like the sea base prepared?" Nia asked, directing the question to Elena. Before Elena could answer, Julian spoke again. "Grilled, with the lemon caper sauce on the side." Nia wrote it down, keeping her expression neutral. She'd seen this dance before. Men ordering for women like they were placing bids at an auction. "And for the sides?" she asked. Julian's eyes gleamed with something that made Nia's instincts prickle. He glanced at Elena, then back to Nia, and when he spoke again, the words that came out of his mouth weren't English. "Nditanda ukufumana izitlo izitcha kuni nuaziparagazi, kwean kazayami funa iraizi yebron." The language flowed smoothly from his tongue, the pronunciation crisp and deliberate. It was Xhosa, Nguni Banta language from South Africa. Not common, not something you learn casually. Elena's eyes widened slightly. Then she laughed, a sound like wind chimes. Julian, honestly, around them, a few nearby diners glanced over. One man in a business suit chuckled into his wine glass. A woman whispered something to her companion, who smirked in response. Julian watched Nia with undisguised amusement, waiting for the confusion, the embarrassment, the moment where she'd have to admit she had no idea what he'd just said. For half a second, Nia went completely still. Her mind raced. She knew that language. She knew it because she'd spent countless hours listening to her father speak it into old recordings, teaching her the clicks and the tones, making her repeat phrases until her pronunciation matched his. It wasn't conversational Kosa, though. This was formal, academic, the kind used in official documents and diplomatic settings. And Julian had just used it to order side dishes while making her the punchline of a joke for his entertainment. She felt the eyes on her, the waiting, the expectation that she'd flounder. Instead, Nia wrote something in her portfolio, her hand steady. She looked up at Julian with the same pleasant neutrality she'd maintained all evening. "Could you clarify the preparation for the asparagus?" she asked in English, her tone professional. "Would you prefer it grilled, steamed, or roasted?" It wasn't the response Julian had wanted. His smile faltered for just a moment, surprise flickering across his features. He'd expected stammering, maybe an apology, definitely visible discomfort. "Grilled," he said, switching back to English with obvious reluctance. Nia wrote it down. "Perfect. I'll have these orders in right away." She turned and walked toward the kitchen, her movements calm and unhurried. But inside, her heart hammered against her ribs. Not from fear, from recognition. In the kitchen, surrounded by the organized chaos of dinner service, Nia found a quiet corner near the prep station. She pulled out her father's notebook with shaking hands and flipped to a blank page near the back. She wrote down Julian's exact words in careful script, the Kosa phrases spelled out phonetically and then translated underneath. "I want to get fresh vegetables and asparagus, and my woman wants brown rice." My woman, not my fiancée, not Elena. My woman, possessive, dismissive, and phrased in a language he assumed no one around him would understand. Nia's hand trembled as she closed the notebook. Her father had taught her 7 languages before she turned 15. He'd made her practice until she could switch between them without thinking, until the words felt as natural as breathing. She'd never understood why. It had seemed like just another one of his obsessions, part of the brilliant, chaotic energy that had defined him before he disappeared. Now, standing in a restaurant kitchen with the smell of searing meat and simmering sauces in the air, she wondered if he'd been preparing her for something. "Order up," the head chef called. Nia tucked the notebook back into her apron and returned to work. She delivered the foie gras and burrata with perfect timing, refilled wine glasses, cleared appetizer plates. Julian and Elena ate and talked, their conversation flowing easily, but Nia noticed things now. The way Julian touched Elena's hand possessively. The way Elena's smile never quite reached her eyes when he spoke over her. The way he dominated every silence, filling space with his own voice. When she brought the main courses, Julian looked up at her with renewed interest. "Tell me something," he said, his tone conversational, but his eyes sharp. "Where did you learn to stay so composed?" It wasn't a compliment. It was a probe, looking for weakness. "Practice," Nia said simply, setting down his duck with precise care. "Practice," Julian repeated, as if tasting the word. "Interesting." Elena was watching her now, too, but her expression was different. Not amused, not entertained. Something closer to curiosity or maybe recognition. Nia finished setting down their plates and stepped back. "Is there anything else I can get for you right now?" "No," Julian said, "but stay close. I'm sure we'll think of something." The rest of the dinner service continued without incident, but Nia felt the shift. Julian's attention kept returning to her, his gaze following her movements across the dining room. It wasn't attraction. It was something more unsettling, like he'd noticed a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit and couldn't stop trying to figure out where it belonged. When she brought the dessert menus, Julian didn't open his. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and spoke again in Kosa, his voice casual but his eyes locked on hers. "Ungumtu obalyo kilio, kadwa uyazama ukuzafala. Diakabona. You're someone important, but you're trying to hide. I see you." The words hung in the air. Nearby diners had stopped pretending not to listen. Even Elena had gone still, her dessert menu forgotten in her hands. Julian smiled that predatory smile, waiting for Nia to ask what he'd said, waiting for her to confirm that he was right to view her as insignificant, as someone whose only language was subservience. Nia met his gaze directly. Then she responded in perfect Kosa, her pronunciation flawless, her tone as formal and precise as his had been. Ukubona no conquenala ukakanda yazinto ezimbini ezalakinio. Kadwan diabulilan go kusinga ukuba and dibalyokile. Seeing and wanting to understand are two different things. But I appreciate you thinking I'm important. The table went silent. Julian's fork, halfway to his mouth, froze in midair. His eyes widened, genuine shock breaking through his controlled expression. Elena's mouth opened slightly, her gaze snapping between Nia and Julian with sudden intensity. Around them, the nearby diners who'd been smirking moments before now leaned in, sensing something significant had just happened but not understanding what. Nia continued, her voice calm, but carrying an edge that only Julian would fully understand. Quain Jinlela, Igrama Yako Yenafutha Ilinsensai. Sa uteta nesi dolo, ufano usebensi imo ifanekili zomsenbin. Kadwa okuba uphandan gamta adhile. Euphanilia konda ilwimi ezafundisaweo and gafambi kakazama okazinza isiksobo. And by the way, your grammar had a small error. When talking about food, you should use the proper verb form. But if you're investigating someone, you should understand formal languages before trying to weaponize them. She'd done more than respond. She'd corrected him, publicly, politely, using the same formal structure he'd try to hide behind. Julian set down his fork carefully, his jaw tightening. For a moment, no one moved. Then he laughed, loud and forced, the sound echoing through the dining room. Fascinating, he said in English, his laugh trailing off into something harder. I wasn't expecting that. I'll give you both a moment with the dessert menus, Nia said in English, as if nothing remarkable had just occurred. She turned to leave. Wait. Nia paused, looking back. Julian studied her with new intensity, the amusement gone from his eyes, replaced by something calculating. Where did you learn Kosa? From someone who disappeared, Nia said quietly. The words landed between them like a stone dropping into still water. Julian's expression flickered, something that might have been recognition or perhaps concern crossing his features before he masked it. Elena was staring at Nia now with undisguised interest, her previous polish cracked enough to show the sharp intelligence underneath. Before Julian could press further, Marcus appeared at the table, his face arranged in an expression of professional concern. Mr. Cross, I hope everything is to your satisfaction this evening. His eyes darted to Nia, a warning clear in his gaze. Excellent as always, Marcus, Julian said, but his attention never left Nia. Your staff is full of surprises tonight. We pride ourselves on exceptional service, Marcus said smoothly. Nia, could I see you in the back for a moment? It wasn't a request. Nia followed Marcus into the corridor, knowing what was coming. He waited until they were out of earshot, then turned on her with barely controlled anger. What were you thinking? His voice was low but sharp. You don't engage with guests like that. You don't challenge them. You especially don't show off in front of Julian Cross. He spoke to me in another language. I responded. I was professional. You were showing off, Marcus hissed. These people are here to feel important, to feel special. Your job is to facilitate that, not to prove you're clever. He was testing me, and you should have failed gracefully. Do you understand what's at stake? Julian Cross could destroy this restaurant with one bad review. He could make one phone call and cost us half our clientele. Your pride isn't worth that. Nia said nothing. What was there to say? Marcus wasn't wrong about the power dynamics. He was wrong about thinking she'd been motivated by pride. Go back out there, Marcus said, his voice tight. Apologize if necessary. Offer them dessert on the house. Do whatever it takes to smooth this over. And Nia, don't ever challenge a client like that again. She returned to the dining room, her expression carefully neutral. When she approached table 7 with a new bottle of wine compliments of the house, Julian was watching her with undisguised fascination. An apology offering? He asked, nodding at the wine. A gift, Nia said. From Marcus. Not from you. I have nothing to apologize for. The words came out before she could stop them. Elena's eyebrows rose. Julian's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. No, he said slowly. I suppose you don't. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card, placing it on the table between them. I'd like to know more about where you learned such impressive language skills. Perhaps we could continue this conversation in a more appropriate setting. Nia looked at the card. Julian Cross, CEO, Cross International Holdings. A phone number, an email address. The kind of card that opened doors or closed them, depending on his mood. I'm not looking for opportunities outside the restaurant, Nia said. Everyone's looking for something, Julian replied. The question is whether they're honest enough to admit it. Elena spoke for the first time in minutes, her voice soft but clear. Maybe she's exactly where she wants to be. Julian glanced at his fiancée, surprised. Elena met his gaze steadily, something unspoken passing between them. Maybe, Julian said. He turned back to Nia. But I doubt it. He picked up the card and held it out to her. Take it anyway. You never know when you might need someone with resources. Nia hesitated, then took the card. Not because she wanted it, but because refusing would create more problems than accepting. She slipped it into her portfolio without looking at it again. Will there be anything else this evening? No, Julian said. I think you've given me quite enough to think about. When they finally left, Julian dropped a tip that was twice the cost of the meal. Marcus nearly glowed with relief. The other servers congratulated Nia on landing such a generous table. But as Nia walked home through the cold night air, exhaustion pulling at her bones, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Julian hadn't humiliated her. He'd tested her, and when she'd passed, he'd become interested. That was somehow worse. In her tiny apartment, with her roommate already asleep and the city lights bleeding through thin curtains, Nia sat on her bed and pulled out her father's notebook. She opened it to the page with Julian's words and stared at them until they blurred. Then she reached under her bed and pulled out a small box she kept hidden there. Inside were the few things her father had left behind. A watch that no longer worked, a few photographs, and an old voice recorder she'd found in his last apartment, the one he'd disappeared from 7 years ago. She pressed play. Her father's voice filled the small room, speaking in Kosa, the same formal dialect Julian had used, the same careful pronunciation. Nia, if you're listening to this, something has happened to me. I need you to remember everything I taught you. The languages aren't just for communication. They're keys. And some doors are meant to stay locked until the right person comes along to open them. If anyone ever speaks to you in Kosa, in Mandarin, in Farsi, in any of the languages we practice, be careful. It means they're part of something bigger than they appear. It means they're looking for something. Or someone. The recording clicked off. Nia sat in the darkness, her father's words echoing in her mind. Julian Cross had spoken to her in Kosa, not as a game, as a test. He'd mentioned her father's name at the table. Samuel Brooks. Casual. Dismissive. Like it meant nothing. But it meant everything. Nia pulled out Julian's business card and stared at it in the dim light. She didn't know what game Julian was playing, but she was starting to understand that it had been in motion long before she'd serve him dinner. Her phone buzzed. Another message. This one from an unknown number. You have your father's gift. Be careful who sees it. Some people have been looking for someone like you for a very long time. Nia's hands went cold. She stared at the message until her vision doubled, then deleted it with shaking fingers. She lay back on her bed, fully clothed, her father's notebook clutched against her chest. Outside, the city hummed with its endless night noise. Inside, Nia Brooks realized that the life she'd been carefully building, the invisibility she'd been maintaining, had just shattered. And Julian Cross had been the one holding the hammer. The next morning, Nia woke to pale sunlight filtering through thin curtains and the sound of her roommate's alarm blaring from the next room. She lay still for a moment, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a map of somewhere she'd never been. Her father's notebook was still clutched against her chest, its leather cover warm from her body heat. She'd fallen asleep reading his notes, trying to find patterns in the symbols and phrases he'd left behind. The mysterious text message from last night felt like something from a dream, except her phone proved otherwise when she checked it again. The number had already disconnected when she tried calling it back at 2 in the morning. Someone knew what she could do. Someone had been watching her, tracking her movements, understanding her abilities. The thought should have terrified her, but instead it sparked something else. A strange sense of validation, maybe, or recognition that she'd been preparing for something without knowing what. Her entire life had been a kind of training, and now someone was telling her the exam had finally arrived. She showered in the tiny bathroom with water that never quite got hot enough, then dressed in jeans and a sweater for her day off. Thursday was her only break from the restaurant, and she usually spent it at the community center across town, tutoring immigrant kids in English. It paid almost nothing, but it was the one place where her language skills felt like a gift instead of a secret. Today felt different, though. Today she couldn't shake the feeling that Julian Cross's appearance in her life wasn't coincidence. Meanwhile, across the city in a glass tower that overlooked the financial district, Julian Cross sat in his corner office reviewing information on a tablet. The morning sun cast sharp shadows across his desk, illuminating the leather surface and the expensive pen set he never used. His assistant, an efficient woman named Patricia who'd worked for him for 6 years, had compiled everything available on Nia Brooks in less than 12 hours. It wasn't much, and that absence of information bothered him more than any discovery would have. "That's it?" Julian asked, scrolling through the thin file for the third time, looking for details he might have missed. "That's all you found?" Patricia adjusted her glasses, her expression apologetic but firm. She learned long ago not to apologize for facts, only for failures. Public records show she's 26, works at Belmont's, lives in a shared apartment in the Heights neighborhood. No criminal record, no college degree on file, no social media presence beyond a dormant Facebook account from 8 years ago. Her employment history before Belmont's is spotty. Some retail, some temp work, a few months at a coffee shop, 6 weeks at a bookstore. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that would explain her skill set. "Nothing remarkable," Julian repeated, his voice flat. He tapped the screen. "A waitress with no formal education who speaks fluent Xhosa in perfect academic dialect is very remarkable, Patricia." "I'm just telling you what the records show, sir. Or rather, what they don't show. There are gaps. 3 years between high school graduation and her first documented job. No college enrollment anywhere in the state database. No tax returns for 2 of those years." Julian leaned back in his leather chair, the city sprawling beneath him like a game board. Missing years. That was interesting. People didn't just disappear from records unless they were hiding or unless someone was hiding them. "What about family?" he asked. Patricia flipped through her notes. Mother deceased when she was 12. Father was Dr. Samuel Brooks, listed as a linguistic consultant and corporate negotiator. He worked for several multinational firms in the early 2000s. Disappeared 7 years ago under unclear circumstances. No death certificate, no missing person case, nothing. He just stopped existing on paper. Julian's fingers stilled on the armrest. Samuel Brooks. The name had been nagging at him since he'd dropped it at the restaurant, watching Nia's face go pale. He knew that name from somewhere deeper than casual memory. "Pull everything on Samuel Brooks," Julian said quietly. "Everything. Work history, contracts, associates, projects. I want to know who he worked for and why he vanished." Patricia hesitated. "Sir, that could take some time. Some of those records might be sealed, or I don't care what they are. Find them." After Patricia left, Julian stood at his window, watching the city move below. He'd used that Xhosa phrase deliberately, testing, playing. He used languages the way other men used money or power, as tools to establish dominance, to separate himself from ordinary people. He spoke 9 languages fluently and could get by in 4 others. It was his signature move at restaurants, at business dinners, and negotiations. Make people feel small, off balance, uncertain. But Nia Brooks hadn't stumbled. She'd corrected him, in front of Elena, in front of other diners. She'd turned his game back on him with perfect pronunciation and formal grammar he'd spent years perfecting. And then there's what she'd said, from someone who disappeared. Julian pulled out his phone and opened an old encrypted folder he rarely accessed. Inside were documents from a business acquisition 8 years ago, a multinational firm that had collapsed spectacularly, allowing his company to absorb their patents and resources for pennies on the dollar. It had been one of his most profitable moves, the deal that had truly established Cross International Holdings as a major player. He scrolled through the files until he found what he was looking for, a list of employees from the collapsed firm. There, 3 names from the bottom, was Dr. Samuel Brooks, linguistic consultant and contract negotiator. Julian's jaw tightened. This wasn't coincidence. That same afternoon, Elena Cross returned to Belmont alone. She told the valet she'd left her scarf, smiled at the hostess who remembered her, and walked through the dining room with purpose. Marcus materialized immediately, all concern and deference. "Mrs. Cross, what a lovely surprise. Are you dining with us today?" "Actually, I was hoping to speak with someone on your staff," Elena said, her voice warm but firm. "The young woman who served us last night. Nia, I believe." Marcus's expression flickered with something that might have been concern. "Is there a problem?" "If the service was." "No problem at all. I was impressed by her professionalism and wanted to compliment her personally." "Is she working today?" "It's her day off, I'm afraid. But I'd be happy to pass along any message." Elena smiled, that smile that had been perfected in private schools and country clubs, the kind that looked genuine while revealing nothing. "That's all right. I'll catch her another time." "Thank you, Marcus." She left, but not before asking the hostess one more casual question about when Nia typically worked. The hostess, flattered by Elena's attention, told her without hesitation. Tuesday through Saturday, evening shifts. Elena sat in her car in the parking lot for 10 minutes, scrolling through the private investigator's preliminary report on her phone. She'd hired him 6 months ago to look into Julian's business dealings, suspecting infidelity at first. What she'd found instead was far more interesting. Shell companies, offshore accounts, acquisition patterns that looked predatory at best and criminal at worst. But this Nia situation was new territory. Julian had come home last night, energized in a way she hadn't seen in months, asking her questions about the waitress, pacing their penthouse while talking on the phone in various languages. He was hunting something, and Elena had learned to recognize when Julian was hunting. The question was whether Nia Brooks was prey or something else entirely. Nia spent her afternoon at the community center teaching English to a group of 7 students, ranging from teenagers to a grandmother in her 70s. They came from Syria, Honduras, Vietnam, Somalia. She moved between them, correcting pronunciation, explaining idioms, sometimes switching into their native languages to clarify difficult concepts. "How you know so many words?" asked Maria, a 16-year-old from Honduras who was trying to finish high school while working nights at a laundromat. "My father taught me," Nia said simply. It was the truth, just not all of it. After class, she stayed late helping Mrs. Osman, the elderly Somali woman, fill out a housing application. The older woman spoke in rapid Somali, frustrated with the English bureaucracy, and Nia translated both ways, softening the harsh official language into something more human. "You're a good girl," Mrs. Osman said, patting Nia's hand. "Your father, he raised you right." Nia smiled, but the words stung. Had he raised her right? Or had he raised her for something specific, training her without explanation, then disappearing and leaving her to figure out why? She took the subway home as evening fell, the car packed with tired workers and students. She opened her father's notebook, careful to keep it angled away from curious eyes, and studied the notes she'd made about Julian Cross. The man was wealthy, powerful, connected. He'd recognized her father's name. He'd used a language her father had taught her. None of that was coincidence. When she got home, her roommate Keisha was cooking rice and beans in their tiny kitchen, the apartment smelling like garlic and cumin. "Girl, you look exhausted," Keisha said, stirring the pot. "Rough shift. Day off," Nia said, dropping her bag on the worn couch. "Just thinking too much." "Well, stop thinking and come eat. I made enough for both of us. And before you argue, Yes, I know you're broke. So am I. That's why we share. They ate together, talking about Keisha's job at the dental office and her terrible boss who kept scheduling her during her night classes. It was normal, comfortable, the kind of life Nia had built carefully over the last few years. Quiet, invisible, safe. But Julian Cross had shattered that safety without even trying. After dinner, Nia locked herself in her small bedroom and finally opened the encrypted file on her father's old laptop. She'd been putting it off for months, afraid of what she'd find. The encryption key had been written in her father's notebook, hidden in what looked like random vocabulary lists. She'd only figured it out 2 weeks ago. The file opened to reveal dozens of audio recordings, transcripts, and scanned documents. Nia started with the audio, her father's voice filling the small room. "These recordings are insurance," Dr. Samuel Brooks said, his voice weary but determined. Nia could hear the exhaustion in every word, the weight of someone who knew he was running out of time. "If something happens to me, if I disappear or worse, someone needs to know what really happened with the Meridian Corporation collapse. They didn't fail because of market conditions or poor management. They were dismantled, deliberately, systematically, and I helped build the language systems that made it possible. God helped me, I helped them do it." Nia's breath caught. She pressed pause, then played it again, needing to hear the regret in her father's voice, the self-recrimination she'd never heard when he was alive and present in her life. She turned up the volume, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. "I was hired as a linguistic consultant," her father continued in the next file. "My job was to help structure international contracts, to navigate cultural differences in negotiation, to make sure everyone understood what they were agreeing to. Standard work, corporate mediation. I thought I was building bridges between cultures, helping companies expand ethically into new markets. But over time, slowly, like watching darkness creep across a room, I realized the languages weren't being used for clarity. They were being used for obscurity. Specific dialects, rare linguistic structures, cultural phrases that carried different legal meanings in different jurisdictions. We weren't building bridges. We were building mazes. And anyone who entered those mazes without a guide would be lost." He paused, and Nia could hear papers shuffling in the background. The Meridian Corporation owned patents in green energy technology, water purification systems, agricultural innovations that could have changed developing nations. But someone wanted those patents cheaply, so they used language as a weapon. Contracts were written in ways that appeared fair in one language, but were exploitative in another. Negotiations were conducted in dialects that favored one party's cultural interpretations. Legal terms were borrowed from languages where they carried hidden implications. Nia felt sick. She thought about the restaurant, about wealthy people communicating over the heads of staff, using languages to establish dominance, to keep secrets. "When I understood what was happening, I tried to stop it," her father said, his voice hardening. "I documented everything. I recorded meetings, copied contracts, translated the real meanings. I went to the board, to regulatory authorities, to anyone who would listen. And that's when I became a problem." The recording cut out suddenly, replaced by another file. This one was shorter, her father's voice urgent. "Nia, if you're listening to this, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you everything. I'm sorry I had to disappear. But you need to understand something. The languages I taught you weren't just for communication. They're evidence. Every phrase, every structure, every formal dialect I made you memorize. If anyone ever speaks to you in those languages, especially Xhosa, Mandarin, or Farsi, be careful. Those are the 3 primary codes they used. If someone is testing you with those languages, it means they're part of the network, or they're looking for someone who is." Nia's hands were shaking. Julian Cross had spoken to her in Xhosa. Not casually, not conversationally. Informal, academic Xhosa. The exact style her father had drilled into her for years. She spent the next 3 hours going through every file, every transcript, every scanned contract. The picture that emerged was devastating. Her father hadn't just witnessed corporate crime. He'd been essential to it, unwittingly at first, then knowingly as he tried to expose it. And the company that had absorbed Meridian Corporation's assets after its collapse was now part of Cross International Holdings. Julian Cross owned the empire built on her father's silence. By the time Nia finished reading, it was after midnight. She sat in the dark of her bedroom, her laptop screen the only light, and understood with perfect clarity that she'd been preparing for this her entire life without knowing it. Her father hadn't taught her languages to open doors. He'd taught her languages to unlock cages. The question was what she would do with that key. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Her stomach dropped, but she answered. "Hello, Ms. Brooks." The voice was smooth, cultured, unmistakable. "Julian Cross. I hope I'm not calling too late. How did you get this number? I am resourceful. I wanted to extend a proper apology for last night. My behavior was testing your professionalism in an inappropriate way." Nia said nothing, waiting. "I'd like to make it up to you," Julian continued. "I'm hosting a private dinner tomorrow evening. Small group, very elite clientele. I could use someone with your linguistic talents. Professional interpretation, nothing more. The pay would be substantial. I work at the restaurant tomorrow. I've already spoken with Marcus. He'll give you the evening off. Consider it a special consulting opportunity." The presumption in his voice, the certainty that she would accept, made Nia's jaw tighten. But underneath her anger was curiosity. Julian was bringing her closer. "Why? What languages will you need interpreted?" she asked carefully. "That depends on who attends. But I suspect you're more than capable of handling whatever comes up." He paused. "Your father taught you well, didn't he?" There it was. Direct. Undeniable. He knew. "What do you know about my father?" Nia asked, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Enough to be impressed, and enough to wonder why his daughter is serving tables instead of using her obvious talents. "Maybe I like serving tables." Julian laughed, a sound without real humor. "No one likes serving tables, Ms. Brooks. We do what we must until we can do what we want. I'm offering you a chance to move from must to want. The dinner is at 7 tomorrow at my home. I'll send a car. Think of it as an audition for something much larger." He hung up before she could respond. Nia sat in the dark, phone still pressed to her ear, listening to dead air. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to stay invisible, to keep her head down. But another part of her, the part that had spent years wondering why her father disappeared, understood this was the opportunity she'd been waiting for without knowing she was waiting. Julian Cross wanted to bring her close. She would let him. And while he thought he was testing her, she would be gathering evidence, reconstructing what her father had started, finishing what had cost him everything. She texted Marcus, "I'll take the consulting job tomorrow. Thanks for arranging it." His response came within seconds. "This is a huge opportunity, Nia. Don't mess it up." She almost laughed. Marcus thought she was getting a career break. He had no idea she was walking into the center of something that had destroyed her family. But maybe that was the point. Maybe you had to walk in the fire to understand what had burned you. The next evening, Nia stood in front of her closet, trying to figure out what one wore to a private dinner with people who'd buried her father. Keisha had lent her a black dress that was simple but elegant, professional without being formal. She wore minimal jewelry, just the small silver necklace that had been her mother's. The car Julian sent was ridiculous, a black sedan with leather seats and a driver who didn't make small talk. It drove through neighborhoods that got progressively wealthier, buildings getting taller and newer, until they reached a residential tower that looked like it belonged in Dubai. Julian's penthouse occupied the entire top floor. The elevator opened directly into his home, no hallway, no buffer between public and private space. It was designed to impress and intimidate, to overwhelm. The apartment was all glass and steel and expensive art that probably had names and histories she wouldn't recognize, abstract pieces that cost more than houses, sculptures that seemed to defy gravity and logic. The view stretched across the entire city, lights sparkling like stars someone had spilled across the earth. From up here, individual lives were invisible. Everything was pattern and light. Julian appeared in a dark suit, no tie, looking relaxed and in control in a way that suggested he'd spent hours achieving the appearance of effortlessness. "Ms. Brooks, thank you for coming. Thank you for the opportunity," Nia said, keeping her voice professional, measuring every word. Let me introduce you to tonight's guests. He led her through the expansive open space filled with ambient lighting to where several people stood with drinks, talking in low voices about things that shaped global markets. Nia recognized the type immediately. Money, power, influence. The kind of people who shaped markets with casual conversations, who determined the fates of companies over wine and appetizers. Everyone, this is Nia Brooks, Julian announced. She'll be facilitating our discussions this evening, helping bridge any linguistic gaps we encounter. The guests regarded her with polite interest, the way people looked at useful tools. One woman, elderly and sharp-eyed, asked her something in Mandarin, testing. Nia responded fluently, and the woman's eyebrows rose with approval. A younger man tried French, then switched to Arabic when Nia matched him easily. By the time dinner was served, she'd been tested in 6 languages by people who viewed linguistic ability as both commodity and competition. Elena was there too, Nia noticed with surprise. She sat at the far end of the table, watching everything with those intelligent eyes, her expression pleasant but unreadable. When their eyes met, Elena offered a small smile that felt like recognition rather than greeting. The dinner itself was theatrical. Multiple courses, each paired with wines that cost more than Nia's monthly rent. The conversation flowed between languages seamlessly, and Nia found herself not just translating but facilitating, catching nuances and cultural implications that others missed. But it was during the business discussion that everything shifted. The guests began talking about a new acquisition, some company in Southeast Asia with technology patents. The conversation was conducted in English, but sprinkled with phrases in Thai and Mandarin, technical terms that carried specific legal implications. Nia listened, her mind working. The structure was familiar. The same patterns her father had described in his recordings. Contracts being discussed in ways that sounded fair but hid exploitation in linguistic complexity. "What do you think, Ms. Brooks?" Julian asked suddenly, drawing everyone's attention to her. "You've been very quiet. I'm here to facilitate, not to contribute," Nia said carefully. "But you understand what we're discussing, don't you? The nuances?" She met his gaze directly. "Yes. And I think linguistic complexity can hide things that wouldn't survive simpler examination." The table went silent. Julian smiled slowly. "Interesting perspective. Do you think we're hiding something? I think everyone in this room is sophisticated enough to understand that language is power. The question is what you're using that power for." An older man in glasses laughed. "She's sharp, Julian. Where did you find her?" "Serving tables," Julian said, his eyes never leaving Nia's face. Which makes me wonder why someone with her abilities was serving tables at all. After dinner, Julian asked Nia to stay while the other guests departed. Elena excused herself to the study, her exit deliberate. Julian poured 2 glasses of whiskey and handed one to Nia, who accepted it without drinking. "You know, don't you?" Julian said, standing by the windows. "About your father. About Meridian. About what happened." "I know my father disappeared," Nia said carefully. "I know he worked in linguistic consulting. I know he was involved with companies that collapsed. He was more than involved. He was essential. Samuel Brooks had a gift for making complex transactions appear simple, for hiding difficult truths in beautiful language. He helped build the system that made my empire possible. And then he developed a conscience." Julian swirled his drink, started asking uncomfortable questions, documenting things that weren't his business. He became a liability. "What happened to him?" Julian turned to face her. "I don't know. He disappeared before I was significantly involved in the business. My father handled it, but I've always wondered if there were others like him, people he trained, people who knew his methods. And you think I'm one of those people? I think you're his daughter, taught by a brilliant man who understood that language is the most powerful weapon in existence. I think you've been hiding extraordinary abilities while serving wine to people who don't even see you. And I think you're finally ready to stop hiding." He stepped closer. "I'm offering you a position, Nia, as a linguistic consultant for Cross International. You'd work directly with me on high-level negotiations. The salary would change your life. The opportunities would be unlimited. All you have to do is use the gift your father gave you. Nia looked at him, this man who stood where her father should have stood, who'd built his empire on the bones of what her father had tried to expose. He was offering her proximity, access, the keys to the kingdom. He thought he was recruiting her. He thought he was winning. I'll need to think about it, Nia said. Of course. Take your time, but not too much time. Julian set down his glass. Your father made the mistake of thinking he could fight the system from outside it. That's why he lost. The only way to change things is from within. Remember that. The car ride home felt surreal. Nia clutched her purse where she'd hidden her phone, which had recorded the entire evening. Julian had admitted his father was involved in her father's disappearance. He'd confirmed the linguistic manipulation. He'd offered her everything she'd need to bring him down, and all she had to do was accept his offer and walk into the very center of his empire. When she got home, Elena Cross was sitting in a car across the street from her building. She rolled down the window as Nia approached. "We need to talk," Elena said. "Somewhere private." Nia hesitated, then nodded. "There's a diner around the corner. Open all night." 20 minutes later, they sat in a booth while a bored waitress refilled coffee they hadn't touched. Elena spoke first, her voice low and urgent. "I know what Julian is doing. I've known for months, maybe longer. I've been collecting evidence, but I don't have your father's expertise. I don't understand the linguistic components, the coded contracts, how they hide the exploitation. I need help. Why should I trust you?" Nia asked. "Because I'm married to a man who destroys things for profit, and I'm tired of being complicit. Because your father tried to stop this, and it cost him everything. Because Julian is bringing you close, and I'm terrified he's doing it to bury you the same way." Elena's hands were shaking around her coffee cup. "I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to let me help you finish what your father started." Nia studied her, this wealthy woman in designer clothes who looked genuinely frightened. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to take Julian's offer. Get inside, but don't do it alone. Work with me. I can access files, schedules, communications he'd never show you. You can decode what they mean. Together, maybe we can do what your father couldn't." It was insane. It was dangerous. It was exactly what Nia had been preparing for without knowing it. "If I do this," Nia said slowly, "I need to know everything. Where my father is, if he's alive, what really happened. I'll tell you everything I know," Elena promised. "Which isn't everything, but it's more than you have now." They sat in silence for a moment, two women from completely different worlds, united by one man's arrogance and another man's disappearance. "Okay," Nia said finally. "Let's finish this." Outside the diner, the city moved through its restless night. Somewhere in a glass tower, Julian Cross stood at his window, thinking he'd recruited a useful tool. He had no idea he'd just brought his destruction through his own front door. And in a small apartment across town, Nia Brooks opened her father's notebook and wrote on a new page, "Not hiding anymore. Time to be seen." 2 days after the diner meeting with Elena, Nia started her new position at Cross International Holdings. She arrived at the gleaming tower downtown, wearing a borrowed blazer from Keisha and carrying the leather portfolio that had once held restaurant orders. Now it held translated contracts and coded notes that only she and her father would understand. She'd spent the previous night barely sleeping, running through scenarios, preparing herself mentally and emotionally for what she was about to do. The elevator climbed 43 floors to the executive level, where floor-to-ceiling windows made the city look like a miniature toy set below. The ride felt both too fast and endless, her stomach dropping with each floor passed. This was real now. No turning back. Patricia met her in the reception area, her professional smile firmly in place, perfectly pressed suit, and not a single hair out of alignment. Everything about her screamed efficiency and discretion. "Welcome to Cross International, Ms. Brooks. Mr. Cross is eager to begin working with you. Your office is this way." They walked past glass-walled conference rooms where people gestured at screens filled with numbers and charts. Everyone looked busy, important, purposeful. This was the machine her father had tried to stop. These were the people who'd kept turning the gears even after he'd disappeared. Nia's new office was small, but positioned strategically. She noticed immediately, right between Julian's corner suite and the main conference room. Close enough to monitor every conversation. Close enough to control every movement. Julian was keeping her within arm's reach. You'll be consulting on the Southeast Asia acquisition primarily, Patricia explained, handing her a tablet loaded with extensive documents. Mr. Cross needs linguistic analysis of the existing contracts and cultural context for the upcoming negotiations. Everything is confidential, of course. Of course, Nia echoed, already scanning the first document on the screen. Patricia left her alone, and Nia spent the first hour simply reading carefully. The contracts were written in English, but sprinkled throughout were phrases in Thai, Mandarin, and Vietnamese. Technical terms, legal clauses, conditions that seemed straightforward until you understood the cultural implications behind each word choice. It was exactly what her father had described in detail. A maze built from language. She opened her notebook, the same worn leather one she'd carried at the restaurant, and began translating. Not just the words, but the intent behind them. Not just the surface meaning, but the hidden implications that only someone trained in multiple linguistic systems would catch. Where English said partnership, the Thai phrasing implied subordination, using honorifics that established hierarchy. Where the contract promised fair profit sharing, the Mandarin legal terms included loopholes that would funnel most returns to cross-international, buried in compound characters whose meanings shifted depending on grammatical context. There were clauses about intellectual property transfer that read differently in each language. Dispute resolution, terms that favored cross-international through careful word choice. Termination conditions that were nearly impossible to meet in one language, but reasonable in another. By lunch, Nia had documented 17 separate instances where linguistic complexity hid exploitation. 17 ways her father's gift for languages had been twisted into a weapon. She photographed each page of notes, uploading them to the encrypted server Elena had set up, making sure every piece of evidence had multiple backups in multiple locations. This wouldn't be like her father's attempt. They wouldn't be silenced before the truth came out. Her phone buzzed with a text from Elena. "How's the first day?" Nia replied carefully, aware that company phones might be monitored. Fascinating. Lots to learn. Elena's response came quickly. "Dinner tonight? My place. I'll cook." That evening, Nia took a rideshare to an address Elena had provided. It wasn't the penthouse she shared with Julian, but a small apartment across town that Elena apparently maintained separately. When Elena opened the door, she looked different. No designer clothes, no perfect makeup, just jeans and a sweater, her hair pulled back, looking younger and more vulnerable than Nia had ever seen her. "Julian doesn't know about this place," Elena explained, pouring wine in a kitchen that was warm and lived in. "I bought it 2 years ago when I first started suspecting things weren't right. Paid cash, put in a trust. It's the only space that's truly mine." "That must be lonely," Nia said. "It's survival." Elena handed her a glass. "I learned early that women like me need exit strategies. We marry men like Julian thinking we're partners, then wake up one day realizing we're accessories. Beautiful, expensive accessories, but accessories nonetheless." They sat at a small dining table, while Elena served pasta she'd actually made herself. It felt surreal, this moment of domesticity in the middle of what was essentially a covert operation. "I've been going through the files you mentioned," Nia said, keeping her voice low even though they were alone. "The Southeast Asia acquisition. It's the same pattern my father described. Language being weaponized to hide exploitation." Elena set down her fork. "How does it work exactly? I can see the numbers don't add up, but I don't understand the mechanism." Nia pulled out her notebook, flipping to her translations. "Here, this clause in Thai references a traditional business concept that implies a senior-junior relationship. In Thai culture, that means the junior partner defers to the senior in all disputes. But the English translation just says partnership. Someone signing this contract might think they're getting equal say, but culturally and legally, they're agreeing to subordination. That's insidious. It gets worse. Look at this profit-sharing clause. The Mandarin legal terminology here uses a structure that's common in Chinese contract law, but it includes a character that can mean either net or gross depending on context. Cross International will argue it means net profit after they've deducted all their costs. The other company will think it means gross revenue. Elena stared at the documents spread across the table. How many companies has he done this to? Based on what my father documented, dozens, maybe more. And because the exploitation is hidden in linguistic and cultural complexity, by the time companies realize they've been cheated, they're already legally bound. Can we prove it? I mean, in a way that would hold up legally? Nia tapped her notebook. My father tried. He had recordings, translations, expert analysis. But he disappeared before he could present it to authorities. I think someone made sure his evidence disappeared with him. Then we need to be smarter than he was, Elena said firmly. We need undeniable proof, and we need it public before anyone can bury it. Over the next 2 weeks, Nia settled into her role at Cross International. She attended meetings where Julian negotiated with international partners, always positioned slightly behind him, translating and clarifying. She reviewed contracts, offered cultural insight, and made herself indispensable. And quietly, methodically, she documented everything. Every contract went into her encrypted files with full translations showing the hidden exploitation. Every meeting was recorded on the small device Elena had given her, disguised as a pen. Every email was forwarded to an anonymous server Elena had set up through her private investigator. Julian seemed pleased with her work. He brought her to more meetings, introduced her to more clients, gave her access to more files. He was doing exactly what Elena had predicted, bringing Nia deeper into the organization because he believed she was too smart to waste at a restaurant, but too poor and desperate to question his methods. He underestimated her completely. One evening, after everyone else had left, Julian called Nia into his office. The sun was setting over the city, painting everything in shades of amber and shadow. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey and handed her one. You're exceeding expectations, he said, settling into his chair. Patricia tells me you've already streamlined our Thai contracts and identified 3 potential issues in the Vietnamese translations that could have cost us millions. I'm just doing the job you hired me for, Nia replied carefully. You're doing more than that. You're thinking strategically, anticipating problems. It's a rare quality. He swirled his drink, studying her. I'm curious, though. You have these extraordinary skills, yet you spent years serving tables. What? Nia had prepared for this question. After my father disappeared, I didn't trust the corporate world. I thought if I stayed small, stayed invisible, I'd be safe. And now I realize staying small doesn't make you safe. It just makes you powerless. Julian smiled, clearly pleased with this answer. That's wisdom most people never learn. Your father understood power, even if he misused that understanding. What do you mean? Samuel Brooks was brilliant, but he made the fatal mistake of thinking morality and business were compatible. He tried to impose ethical standards on a system that rewards results, not righteousness. That's why he failed. Nia forced herself to remain calm, to keep her expression neutral. What happened to him? Really? Julian took a slow sip of whiskey. Honestly, I don't know the details. I was younger then, less involved in the business. My father handled it. All I know is your father became a liability, and my father eliminated liabilities. Whether that meant paying him off, discrediting him, or something worse, I couldn't say. Doesn't that bother you? Not knowing. Why would it? Whatever happened, it worked. The business survived and thrived. That's what matters. Nia wanted to throw her drink in his face. She wanted to scream that her father was a person, not a liability, that his absence had carved a hole in her life that never healed. Instead, she took a small sip of whiskey and changed the subject. The Mandarin contracts for the Beijing partnership need revision. There's ambiguity in the intellectual property clause that could be exploited against us. Julian's attention shifted immediately back to business, and Nia breathed quietly, releasing the anger she'd been holding. Later that night, she met Elena at the safe apartment. Nia was shaking with rage and grief. pacing the small living room while Elena listened to the recording of Julian's casual dismissal of her father's fate. "He doesn't even care," Nia said, her voice breaking. "My father died, or disappeared, or was destroyed, and Julian talks about it like it was a minor business decision." Elena pulled her into a hug, and Nia let herself cry for the first time since starting this operation. She cried for her father, for the years of not knowing, for the life they'd both lost to men like Julian Cross. "We're going to make him care," Elena said quietly. "We're going to make sure everyone knows what he did." What they all did. 3 weeks into Nia's employment, the opportunity they'd been waiting for presented itself. Julian was hosting a major international business summit at a downtown convention center. It would bring together dozens of companies, investors, and media outlets. Cross International was the primary sponsor, and Julian would be delivering the keynote address. "This is it," Elena said during one of their evening meetings. She spread out the summit schedule and attendee list. Maximum visibility, maximum witnesses. If we're going to expose him, this is the moment. "How do we do it without getting shut down immediately?" Nia asked. "The moment we go public, Julian will use every resource to discredit us. That's why we need the journalist," Elena said. She pulled out her phone and showed Nia a photo of a man in his 50s with graying hair and tired eyes. David Chun. He was investigating the Meridian collapse 8 years ago. He published one article questioning the circumstances, and his career was destroyed. Fired from 3 publications, blacklisted, now teaching journalism at a community college. Why would he help us? He already lost everything once. Because he never stopped believing he was right. And because we have the proof he never had. Elena's eyes were bright with determination. "I reached out to him last week. He's interested. Cautiously interested, but interested." They met David Chun 3 days later at a coffee shop far from downtown, the kind of place where nobody looked twice at people having intense conversations. The shop was in a neighborhood where graduate students and freelancers worked on laptops for hours, where the barista knew everyone by their usual order. Anonymous in its familiarity. David was skeptical at first, clearly scarred by his previous attempt to expose corporate corruption. He'd aged since his photo was taken, new lines around his eyes, gray spreading through his hair faster than it should. He looked like a man who'd learned painful lessons about the cost of truth. "I looked into Meridian for 2 years, he said, stirring sugar in a coffee he didn't drink, his hands moving out of habit rather than purpose. "I knew something was wrong. The collapse was too convenient, too perfectly timed to benefit certain parties. The financial statements didn't add up. The timeline made no sense. But I couldn't prove the mechanism. I couldn't show how they did it. I wrote one article, just asking questions, and within a month, I was unemployable. 3 publications fired me. Major outlets wouldn't return my calls. I went from investigative journalist to adjunct professor teaching intro classes to undergrads who think journalism means writing Twitter threads. "We can't," Nia said. She slid her tablet across the table, loaded with side-by-side translations of contracts. "This is how they do it. Language as a weapon. Cultural complexity as camouflage. Legal exploitation hidden in translation." David spent 20 minutes reading, his expression shifting from skepticism to recognition to anger. "This is it. This is what I was missing. The linguistic component. I focus on financial irregularities, but the real fraud was happening in the contracts themselves. Can you publish this?" Elena asked. "If we give you everything, the documents, the recordings, the expert analysis, can you get out before they shut it down?" "Not through traditional channels. They own too many publications, have too many connections." David looked up, his tired eyes suddenly sharp. "But I know independent journalists, international outlets, people who can't be pressured. If we coordinate a simultaneous release across multiple platforms, they can't stop all of it." 5 days before the summit, Julian called Nia into his office with a special request. "I'm delivering the keynote address in English," he said, "but I want to include segments in Mandarin, Thai, and Xhosa. Symbolic gestures to our international partners. I need you to translate specific portions of my speech and coach me on pronunciation." Nia's heart raced. "Of course. What sections?" "Here." He handed her his prepared remarks. Translate the opening and closing. Make them sound inspirational. Talk about partnership, shared prosperity, building bridges between cultures. The usual corporate poetry. Nia took the speech back to her office and read through it. It was full of the same empty promises Cross International had been making for years. Partnership that meant subordination. Prosperity that meant exploitation. Bridges that were really traps. She translated it exactly as Julian asked. Beautiful, inspiring words that meant nothing. But she also prepared a second set of translations. Real translations. Honest translations that revealed what Cross International actually did to its partners. 4 days before the summit, Elena gained access to Julian's private files through a security gap she discovered months ago. She copied everything to encrypted drives, multiple backups stored in different locations. Board meeting minutes where executives discussed linguistic complexity as a competitive advantage. Email chains where lawyers debated how to make contracts legally binding but practically incomprehensible. Financial records showing the true profit margins after companies realized they'd been exploited. 3 days before the summit, David Chun confirmed the story was ready. 6 international journalists were standing by, each with different pieces of the puzzle, ready to publish simultaneously across 3 continents. 2 days before the summit, Julian asked Nia to join him for dinner. Not at a restaurant, not at his office, but at the penthouse he shared with Elena. It felt significant, this invitation into his actual home, crossing from professional territory into personal space. Nia agreed with careful enthusiasm, knowing this was another test, another evaluation. Elena was there, playing hostess with practiced grace, moving through the space with the ease of someone who'd entertained hundreds of times. The 3 of them ate an expensive meal prepared by a private chef who appeared and disappeared like a ghost, leaving behind courses that looked like art installations. They discussed the summit, the keynote address, Cross International's expansion plans into South America and Eastern Europe. It was almost normal, almost pleasant, if you didn't know what was really happening beneath the surface. If you couldn't feel the tension humming under every word. I have a proposal, Julian said over dessert, some delicate construction of chocolate and gold leaf that seemed too beautiful to eat. After the summit, I'm opening a new division focused on international contract negotiation. I want you to lead it, Nia. Full salary, benefits, travel opportunities. You'd be managing a team of 12, shaping the future of how we do business globally. Your father would be proud to see what you become. Nia felt Elena's eyes on her, waiting to see how she'd respond. This was Julian's ultimate move, offering her everything she supposedly wanted, binding her to his empire so completely she'd never question it. That's incredibly generous, Nia said carefully. Can I think about it? Of course, but I'll need an answer right after the summit. This is a time-sensitive opportunity. Translation: commit now or lose your chance. Understand, Nia said. That night, after Julian had gone to bed, Elena walked Nia to the door. They stood in the private elevator vestibule, and Elena squeezed her hand. One more day, Elena whispered. Then everything changes. Are you ready? Nia asked. You're going to lose everything. Your marriage, your lifestyle, your position. Elena smiled, and it was the first completely genuine smile Nia had ever seen on her face. I'm going to lose everything that was never really mine, and I'm going to gain something I haven't had in years. What's that? Myself. The morning of the summit, Nia woke before dawn. She dressed in the professional clothes Elena had bought her, armor for the battle ahead. She checked her phone and found messages from David confirming all journalists were in position. Elena sent a single word: ready. Nia opened her father's notebook one last time. On the first page, where years ago he'd written the encryption key, she added a new line. Today we finish what you started. I'm not afraid anymore. She arrived at the convention center early, watching workers set up the main ballroom where Julian would speak. The space could hold 1,000 people. Media outlets were already setting up cameras. This wasn't just a business summit. It was a stage. Julian arrived an hour later, energized and confident. He barely glanced at Nia, as he swept past, already focused on the performance ahead. Patricia handed Nia a headset. You'll be in the translation booth providing real-time interpretation for our international guests. Mr. Cross wants you ready to clarify any linguistic questions that come up during Q&A. Perfect. Nia would have a microphone and an audience. Everything she needed. The ballroom filled with executives, investors, journalists, and business leaders from across the world. Nia took her position in the glass booth overlooking the stage. Elena sat in the audience, her phone in her lap, ready to signal David Chen the moment things began. Julian took the stage to applause. The lights dimmed except for the spotlight on him. He was in his element, commanding and charismatic. Good morning, he began. Today we gather to discuss the future of international business, the power of partnership, and the bridges we build between cultures. He spoke for 10 minutes in English, outlining his vision of global cooperation. Then he paused and smiled. I'd like to continue in Mandarin, he said, to honor our partners from China. He began speaking the words Nia had translated for him. Beautiful words about shared prosperity and mutual respect. The Mandarin-speaking audience members nodded appreciatively. Nia's hands were steady as she activated her microphone to the main audio system instead of just the translation channels. Her father had taught her to stay calm under pressure. She'd spent years preparing for this without knowing it. Julian finished his Mandarin segment and switched to Thai, then to Xhosa. Each time, speaking the inspiring translations Nia had provided. But when he finished and asked for questions, Nia spoke in her microphone, her voice calm and clear, broadcasting to the entire ballroom. Before we begin questions, I'd like to provide context on what Mr. Cross just said. Julian looked up sharply, confused. This wasn't part of the plan. The Mandarin phrase Mr. Cross used for partnership actually implies hierarchical subordination in Chinese business culture. The Thai terminology for mutual benefit includes linguistic structures that give cross-international sole discretion over profit distribution. And the Xhosa phrase about building bridges uses a formal dialect that, in legal contexts, means establishing control. The ballroom went silent. Julian's face had gone white. Nia continued, her voice steady and clear. For the past 8 years, Cross International has used linguistic complexity to hide exploitation in international contracts. They structure agreements in multiple languages, using cultural and legal nuances that appear fair in one language but are predatory in another. This is how they destroyed the Meridian Corporation. This is how they've exploited dozens of companies across 3 continents. Behind her, screens lit up with documents. Elena had activated the presentation Nia had prepared, showing side-by-side translations of contracts with hidden clauses highlighted. My father, Dr. Samuel Brooks, discovered this practice 8 years ago. He tried to expose it, and he disappeared. Cross International's founder made him a liability, and he was eliminated. Chaos erupted. Journalists rushed forward. Cameras swiveled from Julian to the screens showing evidence. Security moved toward Nia's booth, but David Chen was already on his feet, shouting questions, backed by 6 other journalists who'd been waiting for this moment. Julian tried to speak, but his microphone had been cut. Elena had made sure of that. He stood on stage, trapped in a spotlight, while his empire crumbled in real time. Nia stepped out of the translation booth and walked calmly through the chaos. Elena met her at the side door, and together they left while behind them, the world finally learned the truth about Julian Cross and the empire built on linguistic lies. Outside, in the bright morning sun, Nia pulled out her phone. Multiple news alerts were already appearing. The story was going global, exactly as David had planned. Too many outlets, too many jurisdictions, too much evidence for anyone to suppress. What now? Elena asked. Nia thought about her father, about 7 years of silence and wondering. She thought about the notebook full of languages he'd taught her, keys to cages she hadn't known existed. Now, Nia said, we make sure no one else disappears for telling the truth. And for the first time since her father vanished, Nia Brooks felt like she could breathe. The morning of the summit arrived with crystal clear skies, the kind of perfect weather that felt almost scripted. Nia stood at her bedroom window watching the sunrise paint the city in shades of gold and rose, her father's notebook open in her hands. She'd been awake since 4, unable to sleep, her mind running through everything that could go wrong today, but also everything that could go right. She'd written one final entry on the last page. Today, we finish what you started. I'm not hiding anymore. Her handwriting was steadier than she expected. No checking, no hositaschen, just certainty. Keisha knocked softly on her door. You okay in there? I made coffee. Strong coffee. I'm okay, Nia said, though she wasn't sure that was true. She was terrified and determined and grief-stricken and hopeful all at once. Her phone buzzed with coordinated messages. Elena, in position. Ready when you are. David, all journalists ready. 6 outlets, 3 continents. Stories queued to publish simultaneously. It's happening. There's no stopping it now. Nia, dressed in the navy suit Elena had bought her specifically for this day, professional and authoritative. She looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Not the invisible waitress serving people who never saw her. Not the desperate daughter searching for answers that seemed impossible to find. Someone new, someone ready, someone who'd stopped running from her father's legacy and had chosen to claim it instead. The convention center buzzed with energy when she arrived. Workers rushed to complete final preparations while early attendees filled the registration area. Massive screens flanked the main stage, ready to broadcast Julian's keynote to the 1,000 people expected to fill the ballroom. Camera crews from major business networks set up their equipment. This wasn't just a corporate event. It was a spectacle. Julian arrived an hour before his scheduled speech, surrounded by his usual entourage. He looked confident, energized, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Nia's entire wardrobe. When he saw her, he smiled and waved her over. Ready for the big moment? He asked, his hand landing possessively on her shoulder. Absolutely, Nia said, and meant it in ways he couldn't imagine. Patricia appeared with last-minute instructions. Nia, you'll be in the translation booth, overlooking the stage. Headset is already set up. You'll provide real-time interpretation for international guests and be available for any linguistic clarifications during the Q&A session. Perfect. Nia would have a microphone and an audience of 1,000 people, plus cameras broadcasting to who knew how many more. The ballroom filled quickly. Executives in expensive suits, investors clutching tablets, journalists scribbling notes, international business leaders representing dozens of countries. Nia took her position in the glass-walled booth above the main floor, her hands steady as she adjusted her headset and checked the microphone connections. Below, she spotted Elena sitting near the middle, phone in her lap, looking calm despite everything riding on the next hour. The lights dimmed. A hush fell over the crowd. Julian took the stage to enthusiastic applause, the spotlight making him glow like he'd been touched by divine favor. Good morning, he began, his voice rich and commanding. Today, we gather to discuss the future of international business, the power of partnership, and the bridges we build between cultures and nations. He spoke eloquently about global cooperation, ethical business practices, sustainable growth. Every word carefully chosen, every pause perfectly timed. He was mesmerizing, and Nia understood why people trusted him, why companies signed contracts with him, why he built an empire on the foundation of linguistic deception. 10 minutes into his speech, Julian paused and smiled at the audience. I'd like to continue in Mandarin to honor our partners from China and demonstrate our commitment to true cultural understanding. He switched languages smoothly, speaking the phrases Nia had translated for him. Beautiful words about shared prosperity and mutual respect. The Mandarin-speaking attendees nodded appreciatively, clearly impressed by his effort and pronunciation. Nia's heart pounded as she watched him continue through Thai, then Kosa, each segment building his image as a sophisticated global leader who respected all cultures equally. He was performing perfectly, exactly as they'd rehearsed. When he finished the multilingual portions and opened the floor for questions, Nia made her move. She activated her microphone, routing it not just to the translation channels, but to the main ballroom audio system. Her voice, calm and clear, filled the entire space. Before we begin questions, I'd like to provide important context on what Mr. Cross just said. The ballroom went silent, the kind of silence that feels physical, pressing down on everyone present. Heads turned toward the translation booth. Julian looked up sharply, confusion flickering across his face, then irritation, then the first flicker of concern. This wasn't part of the plan. This wasn't what they'd rehearsed. The Mandarin phrase Mr. Cross used for partnership actually translates to a hierarchical business relationship in Chinese culture, where one party is subordinate to the other. The Thai terminology for mutual benefit contains linguistic structures that give Cross international sole discretion over profit distribution, hidden in honorifics that seem respectful but legally establish control. And the Kosoff phrase about building bridges uses a formal dialect that in legal and business contexts means establishing control and dominance, not cooperation. The confusion in the room shifted to tension. You could feel it spreading like electricity through water. Journalists sat forward, pens poised, instincts telling them something significant was happening. Camera operators adjusted their angles. Elena's finger hovered over her phone screen, waiting for the right moment. Nia continued, her voice steady despite her racing heart. For the past 8 years, Cross International Holdings has used linguistic complexity as a weapon to hide exploitation in international contracts. They structure agreements in multiple languages, using cultural and legal nuances that appear fair in one language but are predatory in others. This is how they destroyed the Meridian Corporation. This is how they've exploited dozens of companies across 3 continents, stealing patents, resources, and opportunities while appearing to be ethical partners. Behind her, the massive screens flanking the stage lit up with documents. Elena had activated the presentation remotely. Side-by-side contract translations appeared, with hidden clauses highlighted in red. Audio began playing. Recordings of board meetings where executives discussed linguistic complexity as their competitive advantage, where lawyers debated making contracts legally binding but practically incomprehensible. My father, Dr. Samuel Brooks, discovered this practice 8 years ago, Nia said, her voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom. He was a linguistic consultant who realized the languages he helped structure were being weaponized. When he tried to expose it, when he documented the evidence and approached authorities, he disappeared. Julian Cross's father made him a liability, and he was eliminated, silenced, erased. The ballroom erupted. Journalists surged forward. Camera operators swiveled from Julian to the screens, showing damning evidence. Security moved toward the translation booth, but David Chun was already on his feet, shouting questions backed by the 6 other journalists he'd coordinated with, creating chaos that couldn't be contained. Julian tried to speak, reaching for his microphone, but Elena had done her job perfectly. His audio was cut. He stood in the spotlight, mouth moving silently, while his entire empire crumbled in real time around him. More evidence filled the screens. Email chains, financial records showing the true cost of Cross International's exploitation, testimony from companies that had been destroyed. And through it all, Nia's voice providing context, translating the coded language, explaining exactly how they'd hidden crimes behind cultural complexity. The documents you're seeing are authenticated and verified, Nia said. They've been provided to regulatory authorities in 7 countries and are being published simultaneously by independent journalists across 3 continents. This isn't speculation. This is documented, systematic fraud spanning nearly a decade. Julian finally moved, striding toward the exit, his security team forming around him. But the damage was done. Every camera had captured his silence, his inability to defend himself, his desperate retreat. The image of a powerful man rendered powerless by his own weapons being turned against him. Nia stepped out of the translation booth and walked calmly through the chaos. Reporters tried to stop her, shouting questions, but Elena appeared at her side, guiding her toward a service exit where David Chun waited with his colleagues. "It's everywhere," David said, showing his phone. "Multiple news sites, social media, international outlets. The story was spreading faster than anyone could contain it. They can't bury this. There are too many sources, too much evidence, too many journalists who've been waiting years to tell this story. Outside, in the bright morning sunshine, Nia finally allowed herself to breathe. Her hands were shaking, adrenaline catching up with her now that it was over. Elena squeezed her shoulder. "You did it," Elena said quietly. "Your father would be so proud." But Nia didn't feel triumphant. She felt hollow, exhausted, and desperately sad. The aftermath moved quickly. Within hours, Cross International Holdings' stock plummeted. Regulatory agencies in multiple countries announced investigations. Julian's business partners distanced themselves publicly. By evening, the board had placed him on administrative leave pending legal proceedings. 3 days later, Nia sat in David Chen's small office at the community college where he taught. The space was cluttered with books and papers, walls covered with clippings from stories he'd written over the years. He'd been reinstated at his former publication with an apology and a new investigative role. The Meridian story had given him back his career and vindicated years of professional exile. But today, his expression was somber. "I got confirmation this morning," David said, sliding a document across his desk with careful hands. "Your father died 4 years ago in a private medical facility overseas. He was being held under what they called protective custody, which was really just imprisonment dressed in bureaucratic language. Corporate-backed, legally gray, designed to silence whistleblowers without technically breaking laws. He was alone, Nia. No visitors. No phone calls. Just silence." Nia stared at the death certificate, her father's name in cold official text. Dr. Samuel Brooks. Age 54. Cause of death, cardiac arrest. She'd known he was probably dead, had prepared herself for this moment, had tried to steel herself against the pain. But seeing it confirmed still hit like a physical blow, stealing her breath. He never stopped trying to get word out. David continued gently, his voice soft with compassion. The facility kept records. He wrote letters that were never mailed, made phone calls that were never connected, tried to contact authorities who never heard his voice. They blocked everything. He died believing his evidence had been destroyed and that you'd never know the truth about what he tried to do. He died thinking he'd failed you. Tears blurred Nia's vision. She tried to blink them back, but couldn't. He thought he failed, but he didn't. He created you. He taught you everything you needed to finish what he started. Every language, every phrase, every lesson was preparation. That wasn't failure, Nia. That was the longest game of all. He planted seeds he knew he might never see grow. And look what bloomed. Over the following weeks, the legal proceedings began. Julian faced charges in multiple jurisdictions for fraud, corruption, and conspiracy. His father, now in his 70s, was brought in for questioning about Samuel Brooks' disappearance and imprisonment. The Cross International empire started collapsing as exploited companies filed lawsuits and partners withdrew from agreements. Elena filed for divorce and entered into immunity agreements with prosecutors. She'd kept evidence for years, waiting for the right moment, and that evidence became crucial to multiple investigations. The prenuptial agreement she'd signed meant she left the marriage with relatively little financially, but as she told Nia over coffee one afternoon, money had never been the point. "I have enough to start over," Elena said. "And more importantly, I have myself back. I'm not an accessory anymore. I'm not someone's beautiful, silent partner. I'm just Elena, figuring out who that actually means." "What will you do?" Nia asked. "I don't know yet. Maybe nothing for a while. Maybe travel. Maybe find work that actually means something." She smiled. "What about you?" Nia had been thinking about that question constantly. Job offers had flooded in, companies wanting her linguistic expertise, media outlets requesting interviews, organizations offering positions with impressive titles and salaries that would have seemed impossible a few months ago. But she kept thinking about Mrs. Osmond struggling with housing applications, about Maria trying to finish high school while working nights, about immigrant families navigating systems designed to confuse them, trapped by the same linguistic complexity that had trapped international corporations. "I'm starting something," Nia said slowly, the idea solidifying as she spoke. a nonprofit linguistic oversight organization, will review international contracts for companies that can't afford sophisticated legal teams, translate documents for immigrants and refugees, train people to recognize when language is being weaponized, make sure what happened to my father, what Cross International did to dozens of companies, can't happen as easily to others. That's perfect, Elena said, and I want to fund it. Not all of it, but enough to get started. Let me do something useful with what I'm walking away with. 6 months after the summit, Nia stood in a modest office space in a neighborhood far from the glass towers downtown. The Brooks Linguistic Justice Initiative had officially opened, with a small staff of 5 translators and a growing list of clients who needed help navigating complex contracts and legal documents. The walls were covered with maps showing language families and complex migration patterns. Filing cabinets held translated contracts and case studies. It wasn't glamorous, but real. David Chun served on the advisory board, lending credibility and connections. Elena handled fundraising, using her society contacts for good instead of maintaining appearances. Former victims of Cross International's practices volunteered their time, helping others avoid the same traps. And Nia translated, taught, and built the thing her father had died trying to create. They'd helped a Somali family understand their lease agreement and avoid predatory terms, reviewed contracts for 3 small businesses negotiating with international suppliers, provided translation services for asylum seekers navigating immigration courts. Each case felt like a small victory, a tiny correction to the imbalance her father had discovered. One evening, working late on a contract review for a small Vietnamese business trying to partner with a larger American distributor, Nia pulled out her father's notebook. She'd filled the remaining pages with her own notes, her own translations, continuing the work he'd started. The leather was more worn now, softened by constant handling, but it still smelled faintly like a study had, years ago, like coffee and old books and purpose. On the very last page, she wrote one final entry. "You weren't silenced, Dad. You were delayed. But the message got through. I heard you. And now the world has heard you too." She closed the notebook gently and placed it on her desk where she could see it every day. A reminder of where she came from, what she'd survived, and why she did this work. Her phone buzzed with a message from Maria, her former tutoring student. She'd gotten into college with a full scholarship and wanted to major in linguistics. Could Nia write her a recommendation letter? Nia smiled and typed back, "Of course. I'd be honored." The city lights sparkled outside her window, the same view she'd seen from so many different perspectives over the past year. From the restaurant where she'd been invisible. From Julian's penthouse where she'd pretended to be something she wasn't. From a convention center where she'd finally told the truth. And now from here, in a space of her own making, doing work that mattered, carrying forward a legacy that had almost been buried but instead had bloomed into something bigger than either she or her father could have imagined. Nia Brooks was no longer hiding. She was no longer surviving. She was building something that would last long after she was gone, ensuring that the languages her father had loved would be used to liberate rather than imprison, to clarify rather than confuse, to empower rather than exploit. The story that had begun with humiliation in a restaurant had ended with liberation for countless others. And in the quiet of her office, surrounded by the tools of her father's trade and the future she was creating, Nia finally felt something she hadn't felt in 7 years. Peace. She turned back to her work, translating complex legal language into simple truth, one word at a time, building bridges that actually connected rather than trapped. Outside, the city hummed with its endless energy, full of people who needed exactly what she was offering. And somewhere, she liked to think, her father was watching, knowing that his daughter had taken the key he'd given her and opened every door he'd been prevented from unlocking. The work was just beginning, but for the first time since he'd disappeared, Nia knew exactly where she was going and why. Not because someone had told her, not because circumstances had forced her, but because she'd chosen it herself, carrying forward a mission that had started with one man's courage and would continue with his daughter's determination. She opened her laptop and began composing the next training manual for their volunteer translators, her fingers moving across the keyboard with certainty and purpose, writing the future in the same languages her father had taught her years ago. In the end, language had been both weapon and salvation. The question had never been about the words themselves, but about who wielded them and for what purpose. Nia knew her purpose now, and she would spend the rest of her life making sure others did too. When someone uses their power to make you feel small, do you stay silent to survive, or do you risk everything to speak the truth that could set others free? If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who refuse to stay invisible.